Hello, and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson.
Kevin, thanks very much for joining me today on the Grow Places podcast.
Great to be here, Tom. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, no, I think this is going to be super interesting conversation, very relevant and broad. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. But before we dive into it, why don't you just give a bit of an intro to yourself?
Yep. So, I'm Kevin McKeever, as you've already said. I'm the founder of political consultancy Lowick, which is about 8 years old, focusing in the labour areas, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And then recently, the 3-month-old Hedry, I'm a co-founder of that, which is a cross-party, politically resilient consultancy as well, operating in the built environment. So background recently in built environment and the politics of that, and a long time background in Westminster and local politics too.
Good. So what's going on at the moment then?
God, that's a big open question, isn't it? I mean, what isn't going on? If you remember when the Prime Minister was elected, part of his pitch last year was that politics should tread more lightly in people's lives, particularly after the Boris Johnson and the Truss years. It's probably fair to say the last few weeks over the summer in particular, and even today, politics is in the news every day, and probably not for the right reasons. And whilst we get distracted by the politics of personalities, characters leaving 10 Downing Street, leaving the government entirely, reshuffles, this is all against the backdrop of what we know is a tough economic inheritance for this government and a tough economic situation for the country. And that's felt no more acutely when it comes to the sectors that you and I often talk about, which is, people and place. It is here in London where we're sat, on the South Bank. It's never been harder to deliver housing, both the finances of it, the cost of delivering it, the skills needed, and it's, it'd be very easy to get quite depressed about the state of our industry, our sector and our country. I think there's lots of reasons why we shouldn't do that, but I can see why many can be a bit down in the mouth. So that's probably what's going on. The answer, a lot. And in the other answer, not a lot.
Yeah, very well put. And so maybe sort of scratching at the surface there then a little bit, you've kind of touched on housing as one of the big themes, but what other big themes do you think there are? Obviously, in politics broadly, but specifically related to the built environment, people and place.
I think the politics of people and place all comes together. And I think the wider political context is actually informing and driving and being affected by a number one issue for us and me, and particularly here in London, but around the country, which is housing, right? A good, safe society grows, is productive, and is happy off the back of a secure home. So if you don't have a security of tenure, you're uncertain, that makes it hard to commit to a job. It makes it hard to have children. If you do have children, then it's tough if they are, growing up in substandard accommodation, or how are kids supposed to learn effectively if they're doing their homework in a cramped house, or if they've got to travel, across, huge distances to get to school. What are the pressures on our housing market? Reform would have us believe it's all, well, the reform phrase, of course, famously is, we don't have a housing problem, we've got a people problem. It's kind of supply and demand. When we talk about increasing the housing supply, the government's got a target of 1.5 million over this parliament. Actually, this country needs, over the next generation, 10 million houses. So actually 1.5 is pretty modest. The populist right is saying, well, maybe we don't need the housing if we remove the people. And that's, again, actually is, politics is influencing the housing debate in a different way. But fundamentally, we don't have enough quality homes at the right price that this country needs to house people in a decent manner, and also to make sure we have a cohesive society where people can live, learn and grow. And that is no more acute than here in London, but applies across the country as well. So I think when we see people protesting outside the Britannia Hotel and by Canary Wharf, that has its roots, I think, partly in the housing crisis. It has its roots, it's being inflamed by populist politics, misinformation, and nefarious characters on the hard right of politics. But fundamentally, we're in an age of uncertainty. People are uncertain, fundamentally about their home. They're uncertain about the job they might do in the future if they have one. If we had a blue collar recession of the 80s, which wiped out, the remnants of industrialization. We're probably about to go through that now in the white collar sectors of the economy. So people are unsure about their home. They're unsure about the future of their workplace. They're unsure about whether or not they can afford the cost of living. They're not sure if they can afford the cost of retirement. And they think, and all the while, the world seems a much more uncertain place. Certainly in the world that I grew up in the 90s, which post fall of the Berlin Wall and that kind of the defeat of communism, and it felt like a great time to be alive, the 90s, early noughties. It certainly doesn't feel like that now. And I think that what we see through the prism of the housing crisis is this emblematic of a real age of uncertainty and a lack of confidence in this country, and that drives all sorts of social political dynamics, some of which are quite unhealthy.
Yeah, no, well, I agree with everything you're saying there, and there's obviously a huge amount of insight and a huge amount of different aspects to that. But as you say, that kind of fundamental notion of kind of safety, security for people, and then how do you kind of layer from there, I think is fundamental to what we do in the built environment, and all those themes. So how do you think in that context growth fits in? Where do you see growth? Because obviously it's a strong narrative at the moment within party politics, obviously Labour particularly, but I don't think it's just Labour. It's just generally in Western economies there is this kind of idea about growth. So what does that term mean to you? How do you think about that? Obviously, I'm quite interested because we have it in our name.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think growth is the mission of this government. As you rightly point out, is kind of the mission of most Western governments at the moment, because we're in an era of low growth. And actually, look at the UK. Take a step back. Our era of low growth started arguably in 2008. You look at the rise in GDP per capita. Up until 2008, we were broadly tracking the United States. Now we're nowhere near the US. We've massively tailed off. So we've never really recovered from financial crisis. We appear to have an ongoing productivity problem, and so growth is about investing in people to work in the right industries that deliver a better return for the country. And that's why the government's focused on, the big tech deals that were announced last week with President Trump being in the country. It's why, they're keen to build, a good old fashioned growth stimulus is get people to work, building infrastructure that then itself has a multiplier effect, whether that's HS2, whether it's a second runway at Gatwick, whether it's Heathrow, whether it's new towns. So that's what it kind of means in the abstract. And that's where politics is. But to me, what it means is, going back to that principle of security in place, growth is about ensuring that people have a positive future where, when they're working and putting into society, there's a greater return. Growth to me means that if you're working hard today and finding it tough to meet the mortgage or your rent because you don't own yet, and maybe you're thinking of having children, yet you have children, you have the confidence that the economy is growing, that you're able to buy a bigger house in due course when your kids are older, that your children will have a better future than you've had. That to me is kind of like the social end of growth. And it's often lost in the debate nationally and economically. Now, what is growth when it's personalized? It's more pay. It's a securer existence. It's investing in your family's future. It's, and it's having more disposable income, and it's generally growing the pie so that everyone has a greater share of a larger pie of national wealth. And at the moment, that's just not the case.
Yeah, and how do you see that growth related to places then, in terms of how can cities, towns, how can they enable equitable growth?
Yeah, but if you think of things like estate regeneration and mixed communities that are developed across London, one response to the housing crisis is not a mass house building program of generic homes. That would be such a failure. Yes, we need more housing. We need the right sort of housing. That housing needs to be near amenities. It needs to be providing access to work in a way that we wouldn't have been looking at 30, 40 years ago when people were talking about commuting in from outer London more. So I think growth in a housing context, in a regeneration context in particular, is about places that are fit for the future, that promote healthy lifestyles, that promote social integration through mixed tenures, that have accessible, decent public services, schools, GP surgeries, and have decent 21st century transport connections, whether that's cycle lanes or the DLR in the case of regeneration in East London. I think that's what it means. It's not just growing the economy for its own sake. Its growth is creating exciting, better places where people can thrive and feel safe and put down roots.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think that's really well put, and completely agree with everything you've said. And I think there's there must be a lot of consensus around everything you've said. Obviously, clearly, that certain people may have different views. So the kind of the messaging and the mission seems to be quite clear. The how to, as opposed to the why to, I think is kind of where you and I spend a lot of our time, and maybe there's a lot of the energy at the moment is directed towards. So how do you see that then? Because in an environment where there is, we talk about viability in our industry, which in simple terms is, the economics of development, or the economics of doing anything really within the society. It all comes back to that ever so boring topic of money, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think we have a fundamental problem at the moment, which has been long running, and particularly exists on the left with the Labour Party in national and local government, of a mistrust often of motives on both sides. That I've never known a time when the expectations, or at the very least the public expectations of politicians at a local and national level, are not necessarily rooted in the reality of developers. And there's a mistrust between the two, and the economic, and actually a real mistrust of the data of the economics of housing delivery. The cost of land, the most expensive element of any development is the land. And
used to be,
probably construction now.
But
exactly,
yeah.
So even the starting point, that was never really understood by, and then you layer in a 60% increase in construction costs, and then you layer in, the risk, the capital risk that you're going to have to price in based on, fire safety regulations and everything else, or just the planning risk generally. And I think the often on the left, there's a view that developers are, out to get one over on the public sector, that they're operating at massive margins, that they are opaque when it comes to, going through the numbers and being honest about it. And then I think on the developer side, there's a disconnect, thinking all the politicians are stupid, they don't understand it, which is not the case. Sometimes they don't, but they do understand the principles. And that, that's led to a position where we're not able to deliver a lot of housing in London in particular. That is the public and the private in there, I think, are slightly detached. I think the private appreciation on issues like viability, particularly, say, amongst many London council leaders, is known by the Mayor of London and the Deputy Mayor. The era of 35%, at a baseline affordable level for large parts of the capital are gone, and that's likely to be, formally recognised pretty soon, and that might start to get us moving. So I think moving the developers back to trying to meet in the middle again between developer expectation and the economics of delivery, and then the public sector, the political, particularly on the left, understanding of the economic realities. I think hopefully we can inch them closer together again. I think that we've had a problem that in the kind of the good years, as it were, of which didn't seem good at the time, but they seem a lot better than they were 10 years ago. We've definitely had a layering on of the planning system, the planning delivery, taking on lots of other social policy objectives, education, health, transport. You see that, when you go through viability, just exactly what all the demands are on a planning application, and actually the system can't cope with that. And that's happened in an era of tightening fiscal context for central government and local government. You can see why that's happened, but we've reached a point where that's become overloaded. So we're going to have a reset where some of those expectations are released. Systems like, for instance, which seemed good at the time, late stage reviews, basically allowing for a mechanism in the future that if developers do better than expected, then you essentially claw that back and get more affordable housing. Seemed okay in principle at the time when it was introduced by James Murray here in London, but actually the market often views that as a communist style cap on what they're able to earn. And in a difficult time like now, the concept of a late stage review just kills the pricing of risk for capital coming into the sector along with everything else. So I think we're probably at a point where we need a reset, and I say meet in the middle from the public and the private sector, and particularly that labour side of the public sector, where understanding has been varied, but also has been based in a lot of cynicism about development sector and a lot of mistrust.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's all very fair. And you know, there's no smoke without fire in any of these things, is there? So like there's a reason why over the past maybe that trust hasn't been there. And as you say, for some of those reasons you identify. But with such sort of short, in the context of built environment, election cycles, you know, a 4-year cycle where really first year you're getting your feet under the table, you've got 2 years to do something, and then you're preparing for the next election. If you're lucky, you know, you get 4 years. That compared to a development project, or even less so, like a piece of infrastructure like Crossrail or something like that. You know, it doesn't really allow for those two sort of things to kind of to overlap. So I'm very interested in how we can kind of build that trust, as you say, that is that extends beyond any election cycle. Because some of these things are frankly across party, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
Now we might disagree with the cause or maybe the solution to what they might be, as we've kind of been talking about. But I think people are understanding what the issues are that people are grappling with, and it just becomes kind of polarizing at the moment. Without that trust, whether it's trust between the industry, as we're kind of talking about here, or more broadly a kind of societal trust between people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we do need, so trust is built, you know, often on the foundations of, you know, doing what you say you'll do, which the development industry is sometimes not good at, or elements of it. And when it comes to affordable housing, rightly, I get politicians say to me, well, how come this development can't do 35% when these two are being consented nearby that are? Now, the answer is going to be, these people aren't going to build out those 35%, and they're probably going to they just got the consent to be able to flip the land. You know, that affects everybody. So the kind of, maybe the development sector has to get better at, you know, calling out, you know, that sort of behavior. So I think that's one thing. And that then leads to the, you know, the communities often say, well, are you going to build this? You know, lots of areas, but have lots of consultation, like, you know, the East London Docklands, often get consultation fatigue, and actually they often don't, what they consult on never happens. So trust is built on doing what you say you'll do. And the flip side of that is, for the public sector, is, you know, providing the context in which it's easy to do that. So not changing the rules as you go, which I think, you know, it does happen as well. And then have an open dialogue about the reality of what changes over time. You look at, you know, our big estate regeneration, which can be, you know, it's 20, 25 years. That's a generational program. It's perfectly reasonable that the master plan consented in 2006 is not going to be, you know, it's not going to be fit for purpose in 2025. Perhaps we need to be more upfront about saying that early, you know, rather than saying to a whole community that over time this is what your estate is going to look like, that actually this is going to evolve as we all do. So I think building trust requires, as I say, doing what you say you'll do, public sector and politicians providing a framework of certainty, and then within that both acknowledging the kind of inherent variability that adjusting circumstances, you know, presents. And I think that would go some way. I mean, I remember, particularly on the trust between Labour and the development sector before the general election, I remember speaking to senior politicians and officials at the Labour Party when they're doing sector by sector engagement. And the one sector they hadn't formally properly organised and approached me to help organise and help on was with the built environment. And that's because the first thing they said was, well, most of them are Tory donors. And you know, we don't like working with them. And in fact, very early on, for instance, I remember Keir Starmer's team would only let him basically speak to social providers. And Angela Rayner early on would only talk to social providers, and the likes of, you know, Lisa Nandy when she was in brief. So, you know, that trust is a long road, because it's been a long time in the breaking, if it ever existed.
Yeah. And so how do you see the notion or the idea of pro-business then, in a broader sense? Because there is, you know, a very, I think, a lazy and kind of thing which is like attributed to the left is, okay, well, the left isn't pro-business and the right somehow is pro-business. And obviously it's quite topical at the moment with, you know, some of the press in the news around big occupiers leaving, or tax or whatever it might be. And that all filters down into development as well, doesn't it? A developer having confidence that the local authority, whether it's a borough level or at national level, is kind of pro-development in some sense. And what I think that really means is that there is that, maybe not trust, but at least there's a kind of understanding of where each party comes from. Which each side comes from, I should say, and that maybe there's a kind of collective will to work towards a solution. So how do you see that?
I think the concept of being pro-business, particularly on the left, starts from a position of, in a capitalist economy, markets need to be regulated and controlled and constrained, and their motives probably aren't always. You've got to assume their motives aren't, at the very least, aren't neutral. That is different from on the right, that would say that an enterprise economy is built on a market flourishing and it needs some controls. So there's inherent, quite frankly, in large parts of the left, suspicion of the profit motive. It does come down to that. I think being pro-business in the broadest sense is about creating the environment for business to flourish, help grow the economy, but in a way which is fair, is non-exploitative, and that can be in terms of employment conditions, wages, but also the type of, in housing context, type of accommodation and communities people are living in, and which has a social conscience. And I think that's the kind of position that most on the left would come from. Fundamentally, however, there are lots of people in the Labour Party who perhaps don't have a private sector background, and that goes for the grassroots as well as Parliament. In fact, a large number of the parliamentary party have not had significant experience in the for-profit sector. For them, they're focused on distributing the proceeds of growth, but distributing the wealth. The politician I worked for when I was quite young was quite fond of saying, in order to distribute wealth, someone's got to create it in the first place, and you can't forget the other half of it. And I think that's often the case that happens. Look at it at the moment in the debate around, what's happening in Parliament around, say, two-child benefit cap and things like that. It's all very well and good, but fundamentally, we do have to go back to the basics of having more wealth in the economy, and then we can work out how it's distributed. Whereas some elements on the left can be concerned with the intellectual fairness of. They'd rather be intellectually pure on the distribution of a smaller pie than take some of the guardrails back a bit in order to allow for a bigger pie in the first place. So I think that's the way the pro-business, and therefore it's quite an elastic concept.
Yeah, okay, that's well put. I'd not thought about it that way before. But one way the public sector can sort of sidestep that to some respect is by taking the initiative and being direct in development, whether it's big infrastructure projects or whether it's bringing the rail back in, or whether it's developing land that's in public sector. So how do you see that element of taking responsibility and delivering towards these targets as the public sector?
I think the public sector should do much more of that enabling, particularly on the land. Wherever we are in the country, there are large swathes of public sector land, and actually, we've got a housing grant system which has gone up under Labour, and some of the movement in the housing market in London on the affordable side has been because of increased housing grant. But actually, the public sector were more proactive in its putting its land in early, and having a model whereby the public gain is out the back end, whether it's long-term lease, whatever the model is. I think that could go a long way. The public sectors don't take on a large part of the risk. I think local authorities are great at long-term regeneration programs where they work in partnership over a long period of time. They get the best results. Their costs are more controlled. They've got long-term partners. There's some great developers out there that local authorities speak highly of. But fundamentally, we have never built more houses in this country at any one time than when it's been led by the public sector. The great council house building program post Second World War was obviously led by the public sector. Now, it doesn't mean to say that, say in the case of new towns, that it's a public builder that's doing it, but maybe it should be the public sector doing the master planning and controlling the sale of the plots and getting the development gain from it. The public sector, I think, should be an active participant in development and housing growth, but it should also it should be a facilitator of private sector involvement too.
Yeah. And one sort of lever that the public sector has is obviously the fiscal policy and printing of money, or how do you see the approach there? Because obviously it's always seen as a kind of short-term win sometimes to do that. There's obviously, it's very public, the pressure that Donald Trump's put on the Fed, for example, to deal with interest rates and so on, and sort of stimulate. That sort of terminology kind of comes through. Do you see we're maybe moving into an era that here in the UK where that happens? Because it sort of papers over cracks, but
I think potentially. I think at the moment, as of today, that we pretty much have an economic consensus, I'd say, between left and right, but at least between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party as it manifests itself in government at the moment, where with our debt to GDP ratio being what it is, we are particularly sensitive to any movements in the gilt markets. And why does that matter? Because if we want new schools, hospitals, homes, that matters, because if the gilt markets move up, then we're paying more, and we're mortgaging future generations to pay for it. Equally, if we print money, then we're gonna be fueling inflation, and we've seen inflationary shocks to varying degrees over the last couple of years, both because of Ukraine, obviously after the horrendous mini budget with Truss. So I think the role of government here is to first and foremost keep inflation under control, because nothing damages the economy and household finances more than eating into the value of the money we earn. And we've seen that in Britain in the 70s. We've seen it in Argentina, in the last 20 years, in extremis as well. So I think that is the core role. Any attempt to disrupt that order, could be devastating for us. And I think that could become a risk with reform in due course. I'm sure Labour and Conservatives will point out. It's not yet manifested itself as a massive risk in the US, but the US economy is very hot. So the story is not written. The end is not written by any stretch on the economic policy of the Trump administration. Probably after France, the US is probably the most concerning when it comes to public debt. So I think hopefully here the conversation will not lead to a kind of get the interest rates down and have a surge of borrowing to pump up the economy. But we don't know what the reforms economic policy is going to be, so they may well do that. But I think at the moment there's a consensus. You look at the debate potentially within the Labour Party. Andy Burnham's made comments about not being in hock to the gilt markets. He clearly liked to spend more and nationalise more. Whether that's in the best interest of the economy in the country, I think is probably the jury's out on that.
Yeah. Agree. And you mentioned sort of partnerships there broadly, but maybe we dive into that a little bit more, because as you say, I do think there's a huge opportunity for public-private partnerships, where each are kind of, there's some alignment and some trust, there's some shared values around, whether it's at project level or or larger than that. And so maybe how bold do you think we kind of need to be or could be in that respect? Obviously, maybe a sub note to that, obviously from our perspective, like SMEs as well, like how can it not only be the kind of the big house builders or ones who've got 5 projects of a certain scale for track record?
I think it's tough because we talk about long-term partnerships to de-risk projects both financially and in the case of construction to avoid the risk of failure, particularly in things like long-term estate regeneration, but other parts of development that kind of mitigates against the involvement of SMEs. That's kind of where the sector's going. And yet there are, some boroughs are very good in London at having, targeting SMEs for some of their infill programs and smaller site programs. It kind of is a truism that also when house building was flourishing, it was pretty diverse. There were big regional players, there were small local builders. So should local authorities, it's a mixed message to local authorities to say partnership's important with long-term partners, which means big, deep balance sheet, safe balance sheet, and also a strong track record. But also we need to facilitate the rise of SME builders, which probably also means being much more open to modern methods of construction and different types of housing delivery. Maybe that's something that we'll see more of in the imminent new towns. That'd be great to see some of the master planning provide plots and areas in the new towns for SME builders, for regional contractors, for modern methods of construction. But I think fundamentally, partnership for the public sector is always going to be based on managing risk, and that's fundamentally going to come down to safe, long-term, probably quite well-established corporate private sector partners.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, Kevin, we've had an amazing in-depth conversation there, super insightful from you, given your relationships at, at, at senior levels within particularly the Labour Party and just in politics generally. But your work is also kind of rooted in the places, isn't it? The neighbourhoods, the communities that you're operating in, whether that's advising clients like us in terms of public consultation and neighbourly matters and stakeholder engagement. So how do you see that, and particularly maybe around the planning system and kind of that element of process?
I think the process is not perfect by any stretch. I think when it comes to, I think most people are very well intentioned when it comes to community engagement. The amount of variability that you can actually consult on is often very limited. In theory, that should be resolved by the fact that the community will have been involved in the neighbourhood planning process, and therefore they're basing, the development proposals are based on a local plan that everyone's bought into, and is then going forward to be considered by councillors on a planning committee on the basis of their borough-wide strategic framework. The fact is that isn't really the case. Most people don't get involved in neighbourhood planning, and most people don't get involved in the planning process until they want to object to something. I think that creates quite a broken system. I think we need, at the community level, a much greater voice for those who are potential future beneficiaries of development. We've done it a few times where we've had, the voice of those on the housing waiting list in boroughs like Tower Hamlets. We've brought them to the fore when it's come to estate regeneration, whether it's young people who are potentially having to move out of the borough where their generations of their family have lived, in particular the case in some parts of inner London. So, and then planning committees should be, cognizant of that, and it should be structured in a way that they're considering future as well as current residents. Of course, they are councillors, they're part-time, they are making decisions based on the information in front of them, but also their main pressures are from very loud, electors, and therefore it's probably less. It's quite bold. There are councillors that do it, and this isn't a left-right thing. We've seen Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem councillors, Green, probably less Green councillors, advocate for growth for future generations. So I think the community engagement side, I think the processes are often done well, but I think ultimately they could be more impactful when it comes to the decision making. I think planning committees themselves are often, there are some great planning committees, and there's some really good, well-intentioned planning chairs, long-standing, and councillors. There are many who, are probably less informed about the decisions they're making than they should be, and it can often be making, throwing out officer recommendations on quite spurious grounds. That happens less, actually, than probably did maybe 12 months ago in some parts of London. So I think the moving to a situation where there's much more permitted development once the local parameters in a local plan are set, I think is desirable. And obviously that the indications are that's happening via the first planning and infrastructure bill that's going through Parliament. There'd be reduced role of, reduced number of planning committee members, etc. I had a fascinating conversation this morning with an American client who's developing a landmark site in the West End, and he's just delivered a development in Manhattan. And he said the planning consultant was taking him through the process to get from day one pre-app through to resolution to grant, and he was took some persuading that was a realistic view, because in Manhattan, actually, if you fit the criteria for the zoning, you're pretty much then left to get on with it. It's obviously not quite that straightforward, but it's not far off. And he kind of said, "It's no wonder you guys are having a problem with doing anything." And I think we kind of need to reflect on that international experience.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting example, because on the previous episode of the podcast we had Kai Yuan from Bjarke Ingels Group Architects, and they work all across the world, and he said that the UK is by far the slowest place in the world that they work from a planning perspective. He said it's a fascinating place and rich, and all these other examples of culturally rich. I mean, in terms of the process, but yeah, he was like, just in terms of pure speed and certainty, it's the slowest. And so yeah, we do have to probably think about that with some respects. But it's not an easy one to unpick, the planning system. We're definitely not going to kind of
No, it's not.
solve it today.
No.
But I do think as part of this sort of growth agenda, as part of this Get Britain building, it's fundamental, isn't it?
It just shouldn't be this hard.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take this long.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be possible to deliver, a tunnel in Scandinavia for the same cost to do the pre-app work on the Lower Thames crossing.
Yeah.
That is just ludicrous.
Yeah.
It's the amount it's cost to, in the preparation for the second runway application for Gatwick. Let's remind ourselves, this isn't Heathrow where you demolishing homes and expanding the airport boundary. We're moving a service runway 12 meters.
Yeah.
It's taken this long to do a runway 12 meters within the existing airport boundary. It should not be this hard. And that is not a left-right thing.
No, exactly. And at the end of the day, what I think planning and development does have an amazing opportunity to kind of improve people's quality of life and kind of tackle some of these big issues that we're talking about here. We've touched on housing growth, affordability, public services, and for you personally, then all of that is clearly really emotive for you, really driving you on a day-to-day basis. So why are you doing this? Why are you really putting your energy into the businesses and to politics and its surroundings, really?
Because I think it's one area where you get to see the effect of your work and the positive human impact of it. It can take some time to do that, as you say. You can sometimes lose the kind of, the wood for the trees. But, a great example is where I live in East London. I can see from my balcony the first project I ever worked on, one of the first ever worked on consultation in over the river in Canning Town, which, I remember doing the door-by-door consultation on decant for Newham Council and remembering what poor quality housing that was and how it was it was a pretty grim area. It was really suffering for the decline of the docks throughout the 70s and 80s. It had real problems with social cohesion. And then, I go there now and it's, it's vibrant. It's a mixed community. It's got higher quality housing. It's got decent public spaces and it's got local amenities. And you think, actually, that is something that we've been part of. I was literally sat in a porter cabin on this site not far off 18 years ago, doing consultations on images on buildings that are now there. And I think that's great. I can't think of any other areas where you kind of get that impact of your work. And and the other thing is when you do housing handovers, and when we're doing one in Tower Hamlets relatively recently, where you meet the people that are moving into the home, and they that's the person that was on the waiting list, or they were living with their family, or sofa surfing, and here they are in their home, and we can lose sight of that sometimes. These aren't units; these are homes, and seeing them built and people in them is quite humbling.
Yeah. And why does that mean so much to you personally? That aspect, because doesn't to everyone.
I don't know. I think it's partly to do with the principles of social justice, which got me into politics in the first place. I've also always had a fascination with the kind of the urban environment. Not that I would describe it like that. I used to, as a kid, I didn't grow up in London, but I used to memorize the map of London. When we had an A to Z from a school trip to London, and I memorized it. I used to look and run my finger and imagine I was going down these roads and look at the buildings and
So you passed the knowledge then?
I think I probably would have done maybe when I was a bit younger. Yeah, I would have passed that test. Might have failed a couple of other social tests. I'd always been kind of fascinated with that. I didn't think I'd end up working in this, but here I am.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I think it's honestly the insights that I'm really glad you've come on, because I wanted to have you on for a while. Just because I think your perspective is so important. We really, really value that relationship that we've got together. And I think it's just good to talk about these things. What we really value about this platform is the long form nature and narrative of the conversation, because everything is so nuanced in our built environment and in politics and society more broadly. And 140 characters isn't necessarily enough
Certainly not
to describe things that we're really talking about here. So I'm really grateful for you giving your time, and I think if more of these kind of conversations were aired, not necessarily just on podcasts, but held between people of different perspectives and different roles within industries, I think can go a long way to maybe hopefully moving towards some of these big themes and big challenges. So yeah, grateful to carry on with these conversations, and thanks for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me on. It's been great. As always, is chatting with you, Tom. And I think you're right. When people are given the chance to understand other people's perspectives in a non-combative, forum, then only good can come from it. And I think, well done to you for being a big advocate of having those long-form conversations. I know it's really appreciated.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.